Let's dive right into Houdini. And here, what I like to do first before I start my character is I like to have a look into my references and see where the different regions would be, where I can start creating like different hair systems. So Houdini as a software is a pretty open software. You can have a lot of different solutions to the same problem. Yeah, I like to start in with a plan before I start my character, so that's why I'm roughly painting in what I want to do. And you can see that the face has different length levels than the neck, for example, where it also has like a lot of different clumping patterns. The legs are also quite special. They have like all these memory patterns there. And I think the other regions would be just the plain body and the tail itself. I like to start my character with creating a geometry node on object level. So Houdini has two different levels. There's an object level and a SOP level, SOP level. And here I like to build my own interface. That's why I'm getting rid of the default interface of the geometry. That as a relative reference into the file name there. That way you will link that to the channel of the object level. And we will also unpack the character and disable polysoups, so every attribute can be read in correctly, like the UV sets and stuff like that. First off, I will drop a subdivide node. Usually in Houdini, the way you're dealing with attributes is that you're not using maps in general. It's not like other grooming softwares like XGen or Yeti, for example. So the attributes are being stored on the point position, and the point position is bound to the resolution of the mesh. It's similar to ZBrush with vertex paint. So we're working on that directly on the points inside of the skin geometry. And I will also drop an attribute wrangle, which I will use as a container to define my attributes. You can group everything in these nice boxes. Houdini has a lot of like options to group stuff, to color stuff, which is pretty cool. So in order to start, we need to define a float attribute, which I will call no hair. And I will also define a density map. So this is basically the values that they have assigned at default level. And in order to define attributes, you have to add a little f, which means that it's a float value in this case. And here we will adjust them with an attribute paint. By default, we will just assign them once and multiply them over later. So I will use a no hair attribute that I will later on multiply with my density map. So all the regions that have no hair are in a separate map compared to the density map. That way I will save some space when it comes to guide generation, etc. So here we need to assign our attributes to be early on defined, and there's like a drop-down menu here where you can switch between those two. If you want to draw on your node, you can just press enter to enter the tool options. With Shift and middle mouse button, you can change the brush size here. By default, there's a foreground color and a background color. You can switch between those if you press the middlemost button and paint. And I would recommend you to just put the soft edge down to a lower value. What I want to do here is I want to just paint out all these areas that don't have any hair, like the eyelids, the insides of the mouth, the nose, and I will speed this up a little bit. For those regions that I don't see currently, I will just mark them with an X. And I will just paint a rough outline, because there's also the option to go to the UV set and paint inside of the UV set. It's under perspective and there is UV view. It's numpad 4 in case you want to use the shortcut. And it's the brush sizes are different there, so you have to go on with a lower radius value. It doesn't matter if your maps are not that clean. We later on add post-processing effects like attribute blur that blurs out the corners a little bit more. And it's just important that you have like a nice continuous color. Even if not, you can always clamp it. So there are always options in Houdini, which is super nice. So yeah, as you can see, I'm just painting like one side of the face, because there are also symmetry options to mirror attributes over to the other side. There are also symmetry options in the paint node itself, but I like to go over the attribute mirror instead of these options, because they tend to be very slow, and you have to do the same for all the attributes. So yeah, first of all, we will drop an attribute blur, which basically softens out the edges of the attribute. And here we will just have to define our attribute, which is no hair in our case. We haven't painted the density yet. And in order to visualize it, you can drop a color node, and you have to put this to points and ramp from attribute, and then you're able to see what you're actually working on. Working with, but yeah, you always have the chance to go back in there and redefine that. So your next step will be to mirror these attributes to the other side as well. And for that I will drop attribute mirror, put this to points, as it's currently set on vertices, I think by default, and put it to other attributes, and then you can put your attribute that you want to mirror in there. You can even put multiple attributes in there. I will show you how that's done later on. And you can see that it's all white. That's because the directionality is wrong, so we have to put this to the negative value so we can use the other side. So yeah, I will start defining another region, which would be my region path. So when you build characters like this, characters like for wolves, for example, we had 8 million ones, and in order to deal with these high amounts of polygons, it's simpler to keep everything in separate hair systems. And more sane if there's an error and you have to debug it, you can most likely see where the error is coming from which hair system. here we will start defining it by groups. You can define it by attributes. It doesn't matter for this. I think it's easier to define it with a group. Start setting this to points and to bounding objects and drop by my own box, and have the translation tools and like transform tools on the left side where you can scale it or rotate it. So I like to use that automatically will drop an edit node into your scene, and yeah, you can drop it into the space where you need it. You can see a preview if you hover over the group node. If you select it, you can see the point preview of what's going on in your group currently, what is selected and what not. So yeah, I will push this out a little bit further here because the thing about Houdini is that you can always change that later on. If you have multiple groups where it's subtracted by another one, you can always change that and it will work. Make sure that it's a point group that you're assigning, and here I will just call this face group. Select the face group in this drop-down menu here. And you can see this. This is what you will get later on as a float attribute. But yeah, you first have to assign it. For that, we will drop a attribute wrangle. And here we will assign a float attribute. First of all, organize the window, and then you can assign the float attribute. Assign a float vector, region face, and that is equal to color R. So color is usually stored as a 3 vector, but we just want one channel of that, in that case the red channel. In order to be multiple maps with each other. Here we will multiply the region with the density with the no hair attribute that we created early on. But yeah, you can also use dependencies in order to link your length to the clump attribute or something like that, or assign a noise value to it, etc. So yeah, we will multiply these 3 regions over each other. So we just work in the region map where the density and no hair is being multiplied over. There's nothing in the density defined yet, but we will surely define something later. In order to preview what you're working on, just drop a visualizer. Set this to the white attribute. That way you can see what you will work on. And this is what we will put into our hair gen and into our guide gen. So here I will create another null. This will be my output for the skin. And this is what I will reference inside of the hair gen as well. So I like to create my own outputs. Later on, we will create our own VDB output too. And if I have like multiple ones, it's always nice to go over that. So we will just call this guides or face guides based on what region we are currently working on. So the whiskers will have one on its own, the neck will have one on its own, etc. So here we will connect the skin geometry and cancel that by pressing escape. And I like to bring that in manually. So I will link that to my out skin that we created earlier. You can find that under the drop-down menu. Then you can see there's another VDB source referenced here as well. We will create that later on. What I like to do here is I like to cancel that once again and basically put the density to 0 because I like to create my own hair gen in there. What's important is that you disable the display as subdivision curves because otherwise it will take a while, and the color is what your guides will look like in your scene. But you can always override that pretty easily. Yeah, I like to set this to a bright orange because I'm just too used to the red. Something more neutral. It depends on the color of your character. White is not a good color to set it to. It's very difficult to see, so I will set it up to something darker. And in here, we will now generate our VDB. A VDB is a voxel-based format, and it allows you to basically work with collisions or with effects sometimes. Also, we often work with that in CFX too. And here I will create a blast. Blast is basically a delete node, and I will set this to my attribute density phase, quite a small expression, so it's bigger than 0.5, and that will kill off all that is bigger than 0.5, and I will this is the one we will need. Tag on the tab box, fill interior. And when the groom defines, we will set this to lower values, but it will basically drive down your performance times and times to work fast. That's why you don't want to start with too high settings early on. I will create another out node. So I can reference that here over the SOP geometry level option in the tab down menu. And yeah, we will link that to our out, check if everything looks correctly. And yeah. And you can switch that over to the blasted region, for example, then you will see the blasted region, but it won't pick up the last node that you were previewing.